Right, it is 2 minutes past 12, so that's our entry time permitted. Let me say just a couple of things by way of welcome. Firstly, thank you for joining. It's lovely to have you with us. I can see that people are here, which is obviously step one in putting on a webinar, some sort of attendance. I'm really pleased we've got that. Just in terms of housekeeping, we are scheduled to run for an hour. We won't overrun, so we'll let you go on time. If you've got anything at all you'd like to ask, there is a Q&A box in the wonders of Zoom. If you could post any questions you've got in the Q&A box, they flash up on a screen in front of me here, and we will do our best to either answer them as we go, or we'll leave some time at the end and pick any up at the end. Genuinely, we're really interested to hear your views, so it would be fantastic from our perspective if you could post any questions that you might have. In the context of today, this is a conversation between myself and my esteemed panel here, really looking into what employees are looking for, expecting, desiring today, and how and to what extent employers are responding to those evolving expectations. So what we're going to seek to do is to highlight some trends, to look at some of those responses and try to work through whether there's a gap essentially between what employers are doing and what people want, or whether employers are ahead of the curve and ultimately find themselves in a place where they are matching expectations with action. Before we dive into our content, it would be really good if I could introduce our panel we have here. Just from my perspective, my name is David Ellis. I'm a partner in BDO. I do things to do with reward, things to do with people, and I've done that for some time. If I read across my screen here, just to keep things nice and ordered, Ben, would it be okay if I went to you next for a quick introduction?
Yeah, great. So I'm a tax partner at BDO, been here about 11 years or so. My particular specialism is global mobility, so really interested to talk about the international remote working aspects of today's session on flexibility.
Cool. And Juliet?
I'm an employment lawyer with Keystone Law, so a pretty ordinary employment lawyer. Also do a lot of mobility work, but Keystone is quite an interesting law firm as well. So essentially platform law, which is a new concept that is working very well.
Lovely, thank you. There's no such thing as an ordinary employment lawyer. Clancy, over to you.
Thanks, David. I'm Clancy Murphy. I love my description. I work broadly across a number of companies looking at all things talent, and my background is as a Chief People Officer.
Thank you very much. Right, so I think that we are quorate in the context of participants. We have a panel. Let's get started. What we would like to do to begin with is ask you a question, if we may. So we're going to flash up on the screen a poll, if we dare. And what that is doing is asking this question for you. What do we think the biggest shift in employee expectation is that we've seen since 2020? I mean, I think that's important. We're not after an evolution over 30 years. Since 2020, what have we seen the biggest shift in? We've got choice one, the desire for increased flexibility in terms of where, when, and how people work. Choice two, the desire to work for organizations with greater ethical or moral purpose. Choice three, a focus on well-being, mental, physical, financial, and social. And choice four, a refreshed focus on fairness and transparency of treatment and outcome. I've slightly cheated. I'm only letting you vote for one. So it would be super if you could push your buttons with abandon, and let's just see what our collective of people here think of the question that we've asked and which button they are going to push. There's a fair few of you online, so we should get a representative view of some statistical significance. Do go ahead. I always find this silence while people vote completely disturbing. So I will just say, as people are pushing buttons, that in response to a question that Claire has asked, we will be sending round a recording of this webinar to people who both made it and couldn't make it. So in the scheme of things, you will miss nothing. There. Now, there is something slightly amusing going on here, because we framed this whole webinar on the premise that you would vote primarily for choice 1. And you have, and that's really good news from our perspective, on the premise that if you hadn't, it would have made for a slightly awkward kind of pivot somewhere in the content that we've got ahead of us. But it's really interesting, I think, that in the scheme of things, we find ourselves in a world where 83% of the hundreds of you that are online today have focused on flexibility as a key focus for employers and employees. So let us think about what that means. If Natalie, you could ping us on to the next slide. What we're going to try to do, and you'll see why it was so important the votes came in as they did, is have a conversation around flexibility. Flexibility, what do we mean by it? Why is it important? How is regulation supporting that flexible world that we sit in? And if we ping on to our next slide again, Natalie, I think where it takes me is just a very ordered conversation, if you like. Firstly, around why are employees seeking more flexibility? What's the driver for this? Secondly, what do we mean by flexibility? Let's think around how employees are responding. Let's touch on that regulatory world that we find ourselves in. So I'm going to just start. Clancy, can I go to you first? In the context of 83% of our panel, of our attendees today, ticking the box that's suggested that flexibility is key from an employment proposition perspective, why do you think that is? What's happened that has made this such a key thing today?
Well, that's quite a loaded question, David, isn't it? Because you asked the question in the context of since 2020. And for those of us who are on the call, we'll all very much remember 2020 from a chief people officer, CHRO, anyone involved in people point of view was hugely challenging. And I think some interesting things happened during COVID, none of which will be news to anybody on this call. And it was really about control. And I think what I have started to see in the 4 years since is really around individuals, our employees, everyone in society has realized that when you lose control, which we broadly did as a society during COVID because we got told what to do and we couldn't control our environment, then your desire for control increases. And I think that has really filtered across into our work environments. And I mean, control, we're going to go and talk about, what do we mean about flexibility? And we're talking about things like how much time I spend at work, where I work, when I work, what does my career progression looks like? And I am seeing, certainly in the companies I'm working with, a desire from employees to have more control over those elements. And that really translates into asking their employers to be rather more flexible around what happens to them in the workplace. So I think there's this big link between our desire for control and our need for flexibility. I think the other thing that's happened over the last few years is employees, and I've been an employee, are tolerant for how we manage our lives. And we know that things that happen outside of work don't always conveniently fit into bit that happens before 8:30 or after 6 o'clock. So that might be a caring responsibility for a small child or for an elderly relative, or actually a hobby that you might have, or a side hustle. We're going to talk about side hustles later, I suspect. But those things don't always neatly fit into the bit outside of a regular working day. And therefore, when we had the opportunity to engage more with those things because of lockdown and COVID, when we came back to work, our desire to keep engaged with those things in a way which wasn't just in outside of the 9 to 5 didn't go away. And I think that's really some of the drivers for flexibility. And I think that's why we've come back into our new world, post-COVID world, and employees are now saying, do you know what? I've had a glimpse of what it's like not to have control, and I'd quite like to keep control. Had a glimpse of the things that I need or like to do outside of my working day, and I quite like to keep doing those, or I need to keep doing those. And that means for me as an employee, I need you, my employer, to exhibit a greater level of flexibility around how I engage with work.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And Natalie, if you could ping us on to the next slide, let's just have a little kick at this a bit harder. So we've just got some data in front of you here. I mean, one of the pictures here focuses on the number of employed carers in the workforce. So these are people who are caring for people, not children, to be completely clear, who are unpaid in doing so, but also working. The right-hand side, we've got some data around the increased cost of childcare over that period. So that we don't pull the data apart endlessly, I guess it's just worth pulling out a specific number here. I mean, in order to get 25 hours a week of nursery care, the data that this is pulled from tells us that that costs £7,134 on average in Great Britain. So that covers the totality of Great Britain in that context. And if you want 50 hours a week of nursery care, it's slightly less than double, because there are some economies in there somewhere. Juliet, coming to you, I mean, take from you will from what this data is telling us, but there is a bigger picture here, I suppose, isn't there? It's not just about what employees are desiring. There's a requirement coming around somewhere here. Do you have any thoughts on I suppose, this macro view, I guess, as to why it's important for employers to place a focus on providing flexibility?
I'm not really sure that things have changed in terms of employees' needs. You know, we have always had to look after children and old people, and the options are still pretty limited in terms of how people do it and how they manage it. I think the real difficulty is trying to get our heads around, firstly, whether these are things that people desire or whether these are things that people really need. And secondly, the expectation equation, which I think has changed a great deal. So if I look back to the beginning of my career, which sadly goes back nearly 30 years now because I'm ancient, when we used to have those conversations about maternity returners, generally the maternity returner had little expectation of being given what they were asking for. And what they were asking for was often very basic, you know, just to be able to come into work a little bit later to pick up the child or whatever. And it was very difficult to secure what they wanted. I always used to say, if I could have a constructive employer and a constructive employee, I could always find something which would work for both of them. But sometimes you had to work at it very hard. Now I think the expectation has completely changed, and employees seem to sort of start from the position that if it's possible, they should say yes, which I think is a very different place. And that means for the employer, not only are they navigating legislation, which in some cases protects people who need flexibility, for example, to look after a disabled child or in fact, any child or an older person or whatever. So not just the legislation, but the need to explain why not, which is very different from the employee having to say why they need it. Yes, they have to say why they need it, but the employer also needs to explain why not. Otherwise, people find it very difficult to accept. And just to recap on the legislative point, there is hard law here. If you say no to somebody and they have a protected characteristic, so for example, they are a woman and more likely to be looking after children, then it is possible that they will make a discrimination complaint if you say no. So it's not an optional thing for employers to think about this. It's absolutely critical that they do try.
Yes, I understand. It's quite an important point, isn't it? Which is that this is not all about employers being, quotes, nice. I mean, there is some hard law to comply with. There's also some pragmatism here, which is to keep the best people. Being nice is not really part and parcel of this definition. It's just doing what needs to be done. So that macro picture, I do think, is quite important. Okay, so look, let's shift on. Let's have a think around what we mean by flexibility. So the first thing, if we ping us on, Natalie, to the next slide, is really looking at flexibility as to where I work. And you will all be aware that in organizations that have the potential to offer this, there has been an enormous debate running for years now. I mean, you forget how long this has been going on for around the concept of hybrid working, and what that means, who's offering it, how it looks, and so on and so forth. What the data on the left is showing us is that very, very broadly, for organizations that have what we've called here remote capable roles, about half of those ultimately are being delivered on a hybrid basis. And hybrid is an interesting challenge for an employer because the world has evolved in the context of the sophistication with which it can talk about hybrid. It used to all be about days. Is it 2 days? Is it 3 days? Are they fixed? Are they flexible? And so on. I mean, talking about days and whether it's 2 or 3 days is obviously missing the point. I mean, it doesn't really matter. The real issue is how you execute the model that you have put in place in the context of hybrid working. It's also worth noting how the picture changes, of course, as your employer gets larger. The smaller the employer, the easier it is to be fully flexible. I guess the trust base is higher in a smaller employer, and so it's much easier for them just to say, yeah, I can see the whites of your eyes, go ahead, do what you want, I don't mind, and on we go. So rather than debate hybrid, because honestly, there's a ton that's been said about it, I'm not sure it takes us a lot further. I'd like us to have a conversation around flexibility as to where I work on a broader perspective and start thinking about where I work in the world rather than where I work in my office. And ultimately, and I guess conceptually, how much we are seeing of that as this debate since 2019 has been moving us forwards. So Ben, can I come to you? I mean, you obviously are working with clients who have a globally mobile population, clients who have people who are desirous of working overseas just because they want to. What's going on? What are we seeing in that world?
I think I'm just going to paraphrase something that Juliet just says in terms of employers coming at it from a position of saying yes. Is probably my perception in terms of where we're at the moment. I think there was a long period post-pandemic where, especially us as tax advisors, we're very focused on the compliance implications. And of course, they're still important. So you think of permanent establishment and payroll, social security, all of those things we've talked about probably to death over the last couple of years, which again, remain important, but there's definitely a shifting of the dial, I think, in terms of employers looking at the art of what's possible at the moment, David. So what we're seeing kind of quite substantially at the moment is a shifting towards, I think still the majority of employers are probably in a position that practically they can't, and there's some that are still kind of concerned from a regulatory point of view, but more and more are looking towards putting a policy in place. So a number that I'm working with at the moment would say, actually have a robust policy in place, but around, let's say 10 to 30 days seems quite common at the moment in terms of permitted. Still parameters around that. So often that will look like 10 to 30 days over a 12-month period, for example. Still requirements around having the right to work, but definitely a shift in that expectation. I mean, what's driving that? Maybe around employee well-being, obviously kind of still post-pandemic, looking at in terms of the world at the moment. Some of it will be from again, I think it's previously mentioned around retention or recruitment. I think there's definitely a piece in there around employers realizing that this is quite a key kind of metric in terms of retaining and recruiting staff. And to say, ultimately, definitely a shift towards looking at what the art of the possible is.
Okay, and so let's try to bring that to life a little bit. I'm hoping if we ping on Natalie, we've got a quick question to ask you as our attendees. If we put the poll up, you'll kind of see what we're trying to establish here. We allow our employees to work overseas if they desire to do so. Yes, in accordance with our policy. Yes, if they wish to do so. We work from anywhere. Yes, if they can show they have a right to work in a country. No, we don't allow it to happen. So this isn't a formal assignment policy or going abroad for business. It's saying, I'd like to work in Spain for a bit. Is that okay? If you wouldn't mind voting, it would be really interesting to see really the preponderance of development of policy in this space and how far that's spread. So I am intrigued to try to work out where it's taking us, because if one looks at well, one takes Ben's kind of theories here, that policy space in this is developing. It's moving forwards in a way that means we are seeing more policies out there than we have had before.
It's and David, I should say, it's not just the policy. One of the other things we're seeing as well is quite a shift in terms of trend towards kind of employment models as well. So from a mobility point of view, we'd have often talked about things like, and again, some people on the call may be familiar with this, kind of global employment companies, for example, as a kind of structure around how do you kind of host these type of individuals. So actually, again, it was historically very much the space of oil and gas, for example, where you had quite transient workers, but we're seeing more and more of these kind of structures utilised within the kind of remote worker scenario. You know, a bunch of clients I'm working with at the moment will have all spectrum of kind of engagement type arrangements, from super remote individuals to contractors to individuals on employers of record, for example. So again, it's just a shift around what we're seeing from an expectation and from a kind of structure point of view at the moment, which is kind of really changing in our landscape.
Cool. Okay. Isn't that interesting? There we are. I mean, I think it tells us it's about half and half, isn't it? Give or take. Half the people are working up, have a policy. The other half are saying, no, we're not there at all. There's an interesting bit in the middle. It's a bit more laissez-faire, isn't it? Yeah, get on with it. You know, that's the piece, I think, which makes people nervous. We have had a question through, which I do think is interesting. I mean, really what it's saying is that as time has passed and companies have started to offer the option of working from another country, it's now becoming a request from candidates who are in smaller companies. And the smaller the organization, I suppose, the higher the cost of a compliance burden to make sure people are comfortable this works. So I don't know. I mean, Juliet, you saw the poll results there. You also are working with people shifting jurisdictions left, right, and center. Do you recognise, I mean, I guess a burden on smaller employers in the context of employees asking for this?
I think it's very, very difficult for them. It's very difficult because employers who are having to deal with this, you know, often have a very limited HR function, no specialist tax people, no specialist immigration people, very little experience of working with professionals who deal with this, and very little idea of the associated costs. And I think one of the difficulties is when people say, can we work abroad? They have an expectation that they can do it. And often they've done it already because they did it during the pandemic. And so they think it's all good and easy. And saying no is very hard. And what tends to happen is they say yes, and then they try and work out how to do it. And it is very expensive. And, you know, I would flag a few things that are a real challenge for smaller employers. You know, firstly, I don't think employers of record are the solution. You know, many larger businesses use them quite successfully, but they are not without their risks. Some of them are frankly quite dodgy. Even the phrase employer of record should tell you something, because we have employers and no employers. We don't have of record. What does of record mean? It's just like saying fake employer, isn't it? It's a very funny term, but everyone get lots of questions about that one. But I think it is really difficult for people. And also, you know, basic employment law, you know, the policy is not everything. People also have contracts. And, you know, the basic lawyers thing, because we're cynical people who often have to dig people out of a hole. You know, when you allow people to do things, you have to think about how you can stop it. You know, how do you get out of the contract you've got into? And, you know, just a very basic level, it's a lot easier to fire people in the UK than it is in a lot of other countries. And people are not really thinking through the whole cost package, you know, from start to finish. They want to say yes. It's human to want to say yes when people are asking for something which sounds perfectly reasonable. But the truth is technology, travel, you know, talking like this over the screens has moved on so fast, and the law, that, you know, tax laws, employment laws, all the rest of it haven't caught up. And it is still hard, and particularly hard for smaller employers.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is to John's question, who he posed it in our chat here. What I think you are describing, both Ben and Juliet, to that end, is a place where it's doable. It's perfectly possible to approach this with a positive can-do mindset that says, with these parameters, you can make it work in this. But the smaller you are, the higher that burden is on a per head basis. And you must get to a place where it becomes too much of a burden, because I don't think anyone is saying it's okay just to do it without any thought. I mean, therein lies the issue. There's a cost of trading here, isn't there? If you do fit this in as part of your proposition, as part of your desire for flexibility, there's a cost of entry. And that minimum cost of entry in terms of getting it right, it's got the little, if you can't scale it up a bit. I mean, you want a bit of volume through your books, I suppose.
Volume, and also remember that saying yes to one person and no to another person raises all sorts of issues and legal issues, particularly discrimination. So you have to be very careful about trying for somebody if you can't replicate it for the rest.
Yes, we need to be careful on a webinar like this. I guess, just to be completely clear, approaching it with a can-do mindset is weighed against. It's weighed against the requirement to get it right. And I think we're all saying the requirement to get it right trumps your desire to offer flexibility.
Well,
I mean, it
people
must
have
be
different
right.
people have different appetites for risk. But
yeah, that's what I was about to say as well. So in terms of that can-do attitude I was mentioned before, I was mentioning certain parameters, and it's still, you know, the businesses we're working with have got that agreed or acceptable level of risk that's still, you know, it is thought out and it's what's acceptable to them in terms of it for a number of days, and still very much some specific parameters around that.
Yeah, I think it's just such an important point that's come out here. So let's just be really clear about this. And indeed, it picks up a question that we've been asked. So we're absolutely in the moment with these questions, that where one is trying to balance employees' requests versus business needs, one of the things which trumps the employee request would be our desire to manage our risk. And for all intents and purposes, that is a circumstance, I think, where employee desire or interest in something, one does hit a wall. It is possible to say no at some stage. That would be a good example. Right, I'm going to keep us moving on just so that we get to the end of our slot here. So this is an interesting one. So we've talked about flexibility as to where I work. This is a conversation around how much I work. And for all intents and purposes, the two little pictures we've got for you here, one is showing the prevalence of side hustles, for want of a better description, cut by generational classification. I mean, you wouldn't have done this 10 years ago. It's absolutely insane if you think about it. And what the average weekly earnings are from those side hustles. The extraordinary statistic here is that for our Gen Z population, still can't bring myself to say Gen Z, I'm so sorry, 76% of the population in that Gen Z territory, I've done it, are meant to be having a side hustle. They're pulling about £223 a week in the context of average earnings from that, which isn't bad at all. I guess it just poses the question, doesn't it? Which I'm going to, if it's okay, go to you, Clancy. What do you think is going on here? What's this thing which is telling us that people want to do something alongside their job? I mean, I'm way too traditional for that sort of lark.
I think I'm with you on that, David. It's really interesting, isn't it? So I had to remind myself who the Gen Z, Zoomers are, and that's the generation who were pretty much born after about 1997, 1998, and so they are sort of the people who are in their early 20s now and upwards. So they're sort of 97, 98 up to about 2010, 2011. So I have two children who fall into that category. So I asked them, what is this side hustle thing? And it's really interesting. I think we're probably going to talk about pensions a bit later. Individuals in that group, I have to try not to call them children just because mine are my children. Individuals in that group have a very different view of what the world of work looks like long term. So when I finished university, I'm similar age to Juliet, and I've had a 30-odd year career. You got a job and you sort of thought that job could be for life, and that we were probably the last generation who thought we could get jobs for life and that was attractive. that is not in any way attractive now to individuals who fall into this Zoomers, Gen Z population. And because they don't think about jobs for life, their thoughts about saving for retirement might look slightly different to the thoughts I might have had for saving for retirement. And actually, what seems to be occurring, and this is anecdotal based on conversations with my children who are in their 20s and their friends, is that what they see is a main portion of work, which might take up the majority of their working time, not the majority of their time, but their working time. And then alongside that, the ability to do other stuff, which generates income, which could fall into the bracket of it's quite fun as well, which gives them the opportunity to earn alongside what they're doing for their main job. And that they see that as both flexible and variable. So it could be multiple different things over a period of time. And they see that as a long-term thing alongside their day job. So when I think of side hustle, I wasn't too sure what I thought. And when I spoke to individuals who fall into that age group, talking about things like selling on Vinted or making TikTok videos or buying expensive trainers when they first came out and reselling them. It is really interesting, the variety of things that individuals who fall into that age group see as something which is completely viable to do alongside what they are doing in their world of work. I think, David, it sort of talks a bit to the thing about earlier when we talk about why do employees want flexibility. I think the generation coming through are interested in both their what we might see as a permanent career, and they probably don't term it that way, but the opportunity to do multiple different things all at the same time. And that's what the side hustle thing is. And I'm really not surprised to see that 76% of employees, individuals, our population who fall into that age group are really interested and actually do stuff outside of their work. Now, the other very small bit I would put onto the back of it, and it was a comment that one of my son's friends made to me, was university, if that is the route you have gone down, let's take that as a population, is extraordinarily expensive. And so they are very used to working alongside something else. So when they go to university, if that is the route they've chosen, they are very used to having a part-time job. I don't know about anyone else on this call who's probably my generation. We sort of didn't have that push so much because it wasn't so expensive. So they've joined the world of work, if they have come that educational route, already thinking that I do something and something alongside it, because that is what they used to. They've done it from quite an early age. And I think that's quite interesting as well. And so when they take their main job, they don't really think about dropping the other one, because I've always done two together. So I think, yeah, the side hustle thing it's a relatively new one on me, but it's very interesting. And it's clearly something which is very prevalent. Far more than half this population are engaged in it.
It's fascinating, isn't it? I think it's quite interesting if one looks at this from a perspective of an employer, enabling, permitting, if that's the right word, your employees to do stuff like this. It's quite interesting, isn't it? I mean, A, it's free. I mean, it's an offer that it doesn't cost anything to enable your employees to do this. B, I suspect it's received rather well to overtly say, hey, this is okay. I'm assuming there is a how far is too far. You end up, of course, don't you, with a complexity, which is, yeah, we were okay with it, but we didn't think you were going to go this far with it. And then you...
I think there's another side to it as well, which is not something that was brought up to me in the anecdotal conversations I've had over the last few days, but I can see happening, which is when your side hustle, your external work collides with the work you are doing through your paid employer. And what I'm thinking about there is ideas like IP, am I using ideas and concepts from work and selling them as a side hustle? Is there some sort of conflict of interest? And we're talking at this level, thinking about selling stuff on Vinted or doing a TikTok video about something completely unrelated. But I can see the challenge, both in terms of what you've described there, which is when the time element detracts from my day job, and if the context of what I'm doing outside of work has some sort of conflict with what I'm doing in work. And I think that's probably something that is going to get tested.
We need a new policy. Clearly, the side hustle policy is on the way, but these aren't actually new issues. We've done it with senior executives for years, haven't we? That the non-executive directorship, you think it's helpful for your CEO to have something, give them a different perspective on how well the people in the industry do things or whatever, and you apply restrictions. I think the interesting thing is that we haven't really thought about doing that in the contracts of junior employees or in spelling it out in policies. So, you know, I can sell that now. Thanks, Clancy. But,
I think
no,
you're right,
seriously,
Juliet.
we need to document it, and we need to get a grip so that people know what it is that they're allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do. And an awful lot of time when people get into trouble, because I'm the expert in people who get into trouble, they do it accidentally because they really do not understand why it's a problem. And I think that explaining bit is as important as the paperwork.
I think that's right. And when we've done it with senior executives in the past, there is a level of understanding of governance and why this might be an issue, which is the table by both parties in the outset. You know, the senior executive I've dealt with have come to the governance team, the head of HR, the chief executive, said, I want to do this. And I'm just, you know, I'm thinking there might be this. So they brought it from a position of knowledge and insight. Whereas our more junior colleagues, I think you're right, are probably not as clued up that this might be an issue, and possibly are slightly thrown off by the fact that we're saying actually this could be a problem for us as a company, and they probably don't see that as a particular issue. And I think if this is something that it's clearly already very prevalent. I'm not sure how many employers really understand how much of it goes on and what the risks to them could be.
Isn't that interesting? Okay, I'm going to move us on just to keep the thing shifting. So we've talked about different forms of flexibility. The next one we've got in front of us here is flexibility about when I work. So a piece of this is around ultimately saying, look, as long as you do what you need to do, we're cool. Which lots of people are so uncomfortable with. Goes to the root of trust, doesn't it, I suppose. And again, we've put some data for you here. We'll ping the slides around so that you can have a look at the kind of data fulsomely in your own time. But what I'd like to have a little conversation about is really around this in practice, I suppose. So, Ben, if I take you as an example, you work in the way that big consulting businesses do in a region that we've generically called, quotes, the North. I don't know where it stops, Iceland or something, I'm not sure. But talk to me about how flexibility around when people are working and the form in which that work takes has enabled that kind of thing to work for you.
So yeah, so I'm based up in the Midlands, as you know, David. But over the last probably 2 or 3 years, we've seen an opportunity to kind of grow out kind of our practice across the North. And you say North's very large region because it covers for me Northern Ireland, Scotland, the North, Midlands, probably somewhere to the south of the Midlands. So quite a big geographical region. And what we've done and what box we're in here is very much that kind of preset schedule in terms of the 66%. So, you know, as a client-facing business, obviously we need to be very focused on clients and client delivery, but with whatever flexibility we can give to individuals. So, you know, for me, we've got like a service level agreement in place in terms of what we need to do from a client-facing point of view. But other than that, there's definitely flexibility in terms of hours. You know, we want people to work core hours. I don't want people to be doing 7 hours like from midnight to 7 a.m. in the morning, because we do need to be together in terms of as a team, in terms of, especially in terms of early in careers, for example, to be there to give them the support in terms of their career. But I've got a lot of people I brought in from a geographical point of view up in the Northeast, where we don't have an office, for example. You know, this whole, what we call from a BDO perspective, kind of workable scenario has given me access to other markets and kind of quality resource I may not have otherwise had access to. And obviously individuals that are, especially those that have got families, and a lot of us got young families, again, just giving that flexibility to them, which has been a real big kind of boost in terms of for our team, in terms of how we've been able to staff, you know, and grow as a team. But yeah, and that's kind of the core of what we've done, and it's very much worked for us.
There's a really interesting piece of detail in here, and we all come at this from our own little specialism, don't we? But I'm doing quite a lot of work with clients at the minute who are trying to establish, for people who are working in different parts of the UK, some of it because of their choice, some of it because it's just convenient for both parties, what that local rate of pay is. And at the end of the day, I mean, I think it must just be worth noting that, for good or bad, salaries in certain pieces of the UK are lower than they are in other parts of the UK. And conceptually, this is not a one-sided benefit. There are upsides from both an employer and an employee perspective.
It's a very, very true point, and it's certainly gone into consideration in terms of how to get the team out. Albeit, I'm slightly nervous with some of the team potentially on the call when we're having this conversation. But ultimately, I think it's very true, and I think it's definitely something for large employers to consider in terms of its and their kind of staffing model going forward.
Yeah. And so, Juliet, let me ask you, because you mentioned at the outset that your work for Keystone Law, it's a different type of law firm, which I think has got flexibility at its core. But why don't you explain how that is and what it looks like?
Well, the law bit is the same. And I often say a lot of the things that Keystone does really well, other firms could do. You don't have to have the Keystone platform law model to replicate it. But I mean, law lends itself particularly, I'm sure accountancy does as well, to remote working. Most of our work is via the screen on Teams, phone, and emails. And so you can do that anywhere. And Keystone does it very efficiently. The thing that I think is quite interesting are the sort of hidden bonuses that I never saw before I started doing it. Time is the big one. For lawyers, we're all very time poor. And I always used to think, being partner in a law firm, I could do without the firm bit. If I've got the firm bit, the client bit, and the family bit, if I only had to do 2 of the 3, how much easier life would be. And, I've effectively dumped the firm bit. I don't do internal meetings anymore. And it is so freeing of time. So that's the first thing. The second was really unexpected, which is with that freeing of the admin side of working in a law firm, which is quite a unique environment, I'd probably say. They also get a change in the people dynamics as well. I have to say it's the most extraordinarily close, cooperative, nice team I have ever worked with. We have probably the biggest employment team in the UK, but we know each other well because when we see each other, we're doing fun things. We might be Scottish dancing or going to an art gallery or going to the theatre together. We don't sit in basement rooms having interminable meetings about our budgets for next year because we just do it. So it's fabulous for law. One thing I would say, and I'm sure that others would say it in other professions as well, it doesn't work for young people. I can say that frankly. I mean, Keystone does not have a lot of very young people. Most people are very experienced. They're people who can work on their own. But in terms of learning, law is a bit like medicine. I hesitate to say that because people say doctoring is far more advanced, but you learn a lot by sitting next to people, listening to them, talking to them, chatting to them, moaning about the things that went wrong and having someone explain what you should have done instead. And you just can't do that remotely. So I don't think it works as a model for a profession as a whole. I could waffle on about this forever, but it's probably enough for a flavour.
It is enough for a flavour because what it shows us, I think, is this is not just about providing an employee proposition that's compelling. This is about different ways of working, provide access to different markets, to different cost-benefit outcomes, to provide different models pursuant to which people can trade. I mean, it's quite an extreme thing, and any organization that's got the headspace for it should be thinking about evolving models to try to bring some more of this in, to harness some of the advantages of it. And it's really important that when we have this conversation around flexibility, that we recognize that there is a business benefit to this that's way beyond ultimately getting 2 basis points up on your engagement survey, which is what a lot of people think this is about. I don't think it is. I think it's much more fundamental than that. On that very deep point, I'm going to move us on. Let's see where we get to next. So here's an interesting one. So for all intents and purposes, the career, in the way that we would understand it, is a different thing now to that which it may have been viewed as being some years ago. Do I stay forever? Do I go, come back? Do I sit in this role and transfer somewhere different? People are looking at this on a much more oblique way than that which perhaps we used to before, particularly in organizations that used to have a very linear career path. I mean, Law's a great example, the path to partner, for example. The data we've got in front of us here is really looking that in the context of organizations who are searching for talent, particularly talent, I think, in fairness, with scarcer skills, the thing which has come out miles ahead of anything else in the context of practices that they will be endorsing or taking on board to increase their talent availability, there's something in here around improving talent progression. Now, I guess in the scheme of things, the sentence around improving talent progression is not about promoting people. I mean, that's an outcome. What we're interested in here are things that give people capabilities and skills that enable them to progress. And I would like, if I could, to go to you, Clancy, really just to see what your views are in the context of this career conversation, improving the skills and capabilities that people have faster to enable this kind of progression to occur. What's your take on what employers should be doing?
So this is a really interesting one, isn't it? We've all, everyone on the call today will have talked about or be aware of or be part of the challenges around finding the right talent with the right capabilities for today and tomorrow. And there is a massive conversation that's been going on for a number of years around talent shortages, the war for talent, and it's very real. And so as an organization, when you've got hold of talent, people who you think have good potential to deliver today and into tomorrow, you're very, very keen to keep hold of it because it's very hard to find it somewhere else. But one of the challenges with keeping individuals in an organization very long term is giving them the opportunity to develop. And particularly, teams like to hold on to good people. That's great for the team. It's not always good for the individual. So what should we be thinking about? And what are the different options to help individuals grow in organizations and to get broader experience, which is then actually really valuable to that organization? And there's a couple of things. Sort of relates a bit back to the whole idea of control and individualized learning and individualized progression, both for the benefit of the individual, because we like to, in some ways, dictate how we develop, but also for the organizations, because churning out people who have exactly the same skill set or purported to have the same skill set might not be as valuable as it used to be. So the sort of things that I talk with organizations about, a couple of things. One is, how do we make the development path more individual? What are the opportunities to really, as individuals develop in an organization, help them explore the things that they are strong at and get even stronger at, and that is to the benefit of the organization, and it really engages the individual and helps with retention and their loyalty to the business. What are the things you can do then? What does it look like? And how do you help someone gain broader experience whilst keeping them in your organization, allowing them the opportunity to explore and develop in different ways? And with that second one, there's a really interesting market developing, which is about secondments, but secondments outside of your organization. And I think this is quite an interesting area when we think about flexibility. And to some businesses, feels a bit alien. What if I'm an HR manager in an organization? I've always worked in this particular area with this particular sector. We know there's another sector that's doing some really cool stuff in HR. And wouldn't it be great if we could have someone who had experience of that really cool stuff, but we sort of don't want to lose you because you're quite good. What if I got the opportunity to go and work in that other sector for, I don't know, 6 months on a secondment basis? And my organization might get someone back. We could do a swap. And that might help me develop as an individual. I can go and get this new experience. It might help the organization understand what that experience could bring. And then I come back to work and I bring all that lovely stuff with me, and everyone's gained. And that, I think, is the future of how we help talent to grow, as well as thinking about, is that something that I individually want to do? And is that something I want to explore? So I think there's two bits here around how do we improve talent progression. I'm going to leave promotion to one side because it's a consequence of, and how do we really click into this idea of flexibility of career, as well as helping organisations to relax a bit more into, if I do those things, am I going to lose someone? And I think there's definitely something about sharing talent across organisations, external secondments, and helping organisations see development as a slightly more an individual sport as opposed to something that happens organisation wide. That is a lot harder for organisations. It's probably slightly more resource intensive, but it also means they have to think and talk to their colleagues and their employees. And that's something that I think we probably should do an awful lot better job on.
Interesting thought, isn't it? So it takes bravery, doesn't it, on the part of an organisation to comfortably second people elsewhere. It actually takes bravery in a matrixed organisation to actually let people work in a different department.
But exactly right. We haven't really cracked that one yet, have we? Now I'm saying just send them to another organisation. I mean, then bravery is high on our list if we want to be flexible. I think, David, we've heard that.
And we have had a question about that, really, which talks to the ability to move between streams and units and departments within firm. I think it's really interesting because you would start there, wouldn't you? You would start there if you were going to start anywhere. Juliet, go ahead.
Now, I was going to say, one of the problems with these long-term development plans is you have to have retention. This is the real challenge for everybody, because we all know when the economy picks up, we've got people who are really cash strapped right across the spectrum. Even at very senior levels, people feel like they have less money than before. And the moment the opportunity comes to go somewhere else that pays people more, they will want to go. So there's a retention piece in keeping people happy, but there's also a difficulty with having very complex progression plans that involve quite substantial investment if it actually just opens the door for people to leave. And I think that's a dilemma that I don't know the answer to. It's going to be a case by case, isn't it? As whether how much it's worth. Lawyers have placed people and clients for years. That it's normal. You get the experience of how the client thinks. You bring it back. It helps everybody else. But the question's always, if they go to the client for 6 months, will they want to come back? Will they want to do the same kind of work because they've grown? And the same with international. I'm sure Ben would have experience of that. You put a lot of effort into a senior executive secondment abroad, but when they come home, are they going to come home to the same job? It's quite unlikely, and people don't think about the long-term impact, benefits, disadvantages, whether they're just going to lose somebody when they've gone.
You're right, Juliet. This is not a new issue. I started my career at Deloitte a very long time ago, and it was a challenge then. You'd send people off to wonderful places, Australia, New Zealand, wherever we sent them, and you'd wonder if they'd ever come back. And I think this is where the engagement with your colleagues, your employees, is super important. It's those honest conversations, those open conversations, which really talks about personal development rather than what's good for the business. And I sense that there's quite a switch now between my early career at Deloitte and how we now talk about it, which is that actually there is much more willingness to engage with an individual and their development plan, rather than what might be seen as good for the corporate. And I think that's quite interesting, but it does take a lot more time and a lot more focus on what we are doing for our individual colleagues. And I think that's a good thing. It also makes it even more painful if they don't come back. So
there's always that side hustle. Maybe that is the route to this external training and development.
It's the answer to everything.
Exactly right.
Right, I'm conscious of time. I'm going to move us along for our last piece of flexibility, which we've put in here. Natalie, if you could ping us along to the next one. We should touch on reward. I mean, it is an important thing where if we can offer people the opportunity to construct ways of being paid that better suit them, conceptually that's a good thing for them. So at its most extreme, we have examples of clients who've offered employees the opportunity to trade out of bonus and get more salary, or to reduce their salary and get more equity. That's at one end of our spectrum. The picture in front of here actually is something a bit more granular, but really important, which is you can see that there is a generational impact on people opting out of pension. And quite a clear one too, for what it's worth. Ultimately, people are looking at certain benefits in different ways. Now, I've got one more poll just to do. If we could ping that up here, it just talks to benefits. I'd be really interested to get your views, and I'm conscious that we're quite close to a close, but we must have time for a little bit of a vote on this. What benefits changes are we seeing employers make to support the well-being of their workforce? You can vote for whatever you want, I think. If you can't, forgive me, but I think you can. I've put here better retirement provision, access to in-the-moment health services such as GP appointments, physiotherapy or counselling, financial counselling or investment advice, green benefits, electric vehicles, charging points, solar panels, heat pumps, holiday. Nobody doesn't like holiday. If you wouldn't mind voting, let's just see where that comes out. While we wait, if it's all right, Ben, I mean, if I look at that list down there, is there anything from the context of the work you're doing with your clients that jumps out as being newish, do you think? I don't know. What are you seeing?
Yeah, I'm not sure whether it's newish, because it's certainly something I've been kind of seeing talked about even pre-pandemic, but around the financial counselling, investment advice, etc. So certainly seen an uptick recently in terms of discussions around financial well-being. I think there's been various programs around for a very long time in terms of from kind of investment managers, etc., around financial well-being, financial education of employees. I've just seen that change slightly in terms of the nature of it, I'd say, in terms of recent times. And again, I think that's probably seen an uptick off the back of the cost of living crisis, obviously the high inflationary environment we've been in recently, etc. And certainly businesses and clients are coming to us to have conversations around how we can support kind of wider client base. And this is probably taking off my hat as a global mobility specialist, where again, kind of flex comes into the way we're looking at programs and assignment packages there. This is on a more domestic level. How, certainly large employers, how do we support our kind of overarching kind of employee base in terms of some of the challenges they might be having around pension changes, for example, lots of changes recently around the kind of capital gains tax regime. How do we generally support people from a financial investment advice in these kind of challenging times? So that's definitely something I've seen a lot, and I'd be interested to see from the results here as to whether that's reflected in the results.
Yeah, I don't know, Natalie, whether you can ping up an answer for us and see what comes out there.
Actually, quite, yeah.
It's interesting in its own right. Right, we've got 1 minute left. I'm going to ping us on just because I'm obsessive about getting to the end and letting you go on time. So let's just touch on a piece of, I mean, it's more of an observation. Don't worry, we're not going to suddenly go through loads of regulations for you. But there is some stuff that's changing now. And the next slide, Natalie, if you ping us onto that, talks to that. And you can have a look in due course about what those look like in your own time, he says. Why I've suggested you do that, I don't know. But ultimately, you can see here things that go to the root of enabling flexibility in those first two boxes. The thing I'm particularly keen just to flag up, I suppose, if we go to the final slide, Natalie, is just to bring out that were it the case that we were to have a new administration coming in this year in a general election, there is some stuff which they have said they would be interested to think about. So that's on the next slide, Natalie. It's just our last one. If you put us onto that one, that goes to the root of a whole list of things which the UK Labour government has pledged a new deal for working people. This isn't a politicised statement. I'm not saying this is a guarantee in terms of our next administration, but the other administration is currently in government. So I think we're allowed to say that we'd be interested to pursue the changes rather than me predicting the outcome of the election. The one thing in here which goes to flexibility is that first box, the right to disconnect. And look, we don't have time to really go through it in any detail, but Juliet, I mean, you've kind of looked at this, I assume. Is there anything you would observe around that kind of thing? It doesn't feel...
I can do it very quickly and
yeah,
save the time. It's politics, Dave. Come on, we've had contracts where people have had their normal hours of work specified for years. We already have the working time regulations. Anecdotally, 1998, when those working time regulations came in and we were to have the 48-hour week, hours and hours people spent gassing about it. I never had a claim. Where are we? 30 years on. I just think this is people talking about something that's worrying people. People don't like being on call, but it's not legislation that's going to fix it. It's people. We have to change the way we work. So sometimes legislation can heralds change, like age discrimination laws. It encourages people to behave, but we're never going to fix that one unless people want to fix it.
That is brilliant. I do love that. Thank you. Look, we are 1 minute past 1. I'd like to thank Clancy and Ben and Juliet for being such wonderful panelists. I'd like to thank Natalie and Sophie for behind the scenes, putting so much hard work into making this happen. I'd like to thank you all for listening. I'm very pleased with that. That you managed to last to the end. That's a real kind of achievement from anyone's perspective. We're running 3 more of these in this year. They're all linked with the kind of concept of workplace evolution. We'll be in touch with the next one in due course. We'll send the slides and recording of this out to the people who attended, so you shouldn't worry if there's anything else you want to catch up on. We've got a couple of questions we haven't had a chance to get hold of. We'll reply to those so that you've got the replies in due course. And I'm going to stop. Thank you very much indeed, and I will see you all soon.